Thank you so much for finding the time, first of all. I really appreciate it, especially now. I would love to chat with you a little bit about the previous productions of Prometheus and this production, where the art is going nowadays in the future and where the artistic interpretation is going. How does this affect musicians themselves, in your opinion, and how does the color and intensity of the light influence the outcome, if there is a way to talk about that, to process that?
Well, I think particularly for this show, I'm not sure how much of the color the performers experience, because they have a very bright stand light in front of them, and that's kind of bathing them in the light. I know that they can see out into the hall, and some of them are angled to see the Luce, and some of them have given me indications that they can see parts of it. So I'm not really sure how much. I think you'll be able to answer that question better once you get the feedback. And they can tell that there are things happening that are supporting the music. I think that is the most consistent piece of feedback that I've gotten, that this show is unusual because it feels very organic to the sound. And I take that very seriously, because that's something that we strive for, and I really work towards in every one of these performances, to make the lights look very musical. At the Concertgebouw, one of the musicians said that it made the hair stand up. There was that frisson that happened. So I know that they are seeing something, but I think their experience is very different sitting on the stage than the audience would be. And then if their stand lights are as bright as they are in this show, they're just kind of sitting in this white, warm white light, and so they're not getting the full experience. What would you say?
For me, performers using technology like this, or specifically talking about the Luce, it's always interesting to see how much I think you can tell a lot about how they interact with whatever the apparatus is, how much they're getting out of it. So I think we've seen with Vitas a lot of growth in the kind of playing of the Luce as it grows comfortable with it, and I think that comes from understanding the output of it in the same way you would with a regular instrument. As far as the rest of the room goes and the rest of the orchestra, I think it would probably be something like not hearing the bass that's across the hall because you're next to the harps. If we're thinking about it as an instrument, like what a member of an orchestra or in their position is, all the other instruments have a relative sound from what we get out in the audience, where we kind of get the whole thing in a more leveled out experience. Balanced experience.
That's a really great analogy.
I'm thinking about this whole entire value of interdisciplinary, cross-transdisciplinary projects, because before, especially in classical music, actually until now, we still do have classical concerts that are very separate from everything else. And what does this combination of music and light bring to us as the audience members, as perhaps as humans, as a community? And also whether this space, the moving space concept, due to the light, changing light and shadow, was sort of planned for certain sections of the piece, and whether there was any message or any feeling that is supposed to be triggered in the audience members due to the devices or the concepts used during the particular places. It's a big question, maybe, but also thinking about what does this bring. It's not just light, it makes you think that the space is moving. And how does this whole unification of arts affect us all?
I think especially the movement, is a lot about, because I think the big thing about this piece is the amount of movement. The color is obviously a really important part of it, but I feel like especially in Amsterdam at the Concertgebouw, they had done shows where color was more of a part of it maybe than the Boston Symphony Orchestra does. And I think the kind of speed and the rate and the changes and the movement of the lights are one of the things that we overlay at a rate that isn't seen in classical music. It's, it's more at home at
exactly.
Rock shows.
Exactly.
And I think the way we have talked about it, and I don't know how the original conversations went, was once we understand what the room has to offer lighting-wise, we start to go back to the score and say, okay, well, what makes good lightning? And I think when I had pre-visualized this one, a lot of the lighting was done with the architectural lights on the walls, but then we found those beautiful
flickers
from the lights that don't
windows.
dim, and they're just a light that doesn't function well at low intensities. So we intentionally put them in the low intensities, so we get the LED flicker that everyone tries to avoid, but that's what the lightning is, because that's what feels the most. Lighting is really like feeling out the room. And I think as we move through it, we start to clarify that language and start to work through, oh, if that's the lightning, then this can be kind of its counterpoint, or if that's the lighting in this color stage, maybe we need something else in another color stage to kind of build on the idea of lightning or flames, or sort of 4 different versions of flames in the show.
Yeah, it's a vocabulary that builds according to what is available in the hall.
And I loved how you mentioned something that usually is considered as a downside or a defect, and you have used it to the advantage of the show. That's special.
Yeah, I think that's probably fairly common in theater. Whatever we have at our disposal, whether it's a $5 light or a $5,000 light, find its value and try it in the show, because
it's really cool.
You're always going to want more ideas to put in, so take more you can get.
Yeah, but I think going back to this idea of like the unity of the arts, this is a very old idea, but it had this revival starting really in the 19th century, and I was so tickled that Wagner is on this program, because I think Scriabin had this very love-hate relationship with Wagner. The symbolists were so kind of intoxicated by his ideas, but then also were very critical of what he was trying to do with his operas. And they wanted to move beyond the kind of the omnia art principle that is sort of came together in Wagnerian opera. But I think that many of the elements are the same. So bringing together these different art forms in a way that feels very synthesized. So it's not just, here we have the costumes, here we have the music, here we have the set design, and these are all things that are layered on top of each other, that there's a unity in the conception. And I think that's what Scriabin attempted to do. Having worked with the piece for as long as I have, I actually feel that it has a very strong design to it that is coming from the score, that is not just random notations. I think he's been kind of criticized for just writing too much or not being very considerate about it. I do see a structure there to the lighting that we have aimed to bring out in our design, and I really do feel like it adds something unique to the experience of the audience. So even today we saw these high school students who some of them have been to symphonic concerts, perhaps others of them haven't. They saw something very unique today, and they just loved it. It was something that they related to almost instantaneously. So here it's based on these very philosophical ideas. We have just spent 20 hours or something trying to cue this thing, but it immediately it speaks to people who have, they have no preconceptions as to what this is or should be, and they are able to just come in and feel something. And so I really like that about the piece. And I really do see that this piece, as high concept as it is, as esoteric as it is, has a direct relationship to a lot of the popular multimedia that is, this multi-billion-dollar industry today. So all the concert lighting, the pop-up immersive art shows, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody wants experiences now. They want to come and have an experience that is outside of the ordinary. And, VR is becoming a thing, and I think maybe this is where this piece is going next.
The future of the performing arts and where does this go? And the fact that there has been light used in theaters, in ballet productions, in museums, even because for sculptures, they light them up differently. But I felt like something is still on the way for the classical music, because a typical classical concert is like a warmer lighting, usually the same, and that's all you get. And this production and your previous productions are, of course, they are opening the door to the future, and it's very important, I think, that it has finally come to this. Do you feel that I was going to talk about the limits, because of course I think we discussed some other genres, some other shows where there are other sorts of lighting used, and you just mentioned that BSO used less facilities than the Concertgebouw, I think.
I think they're different, but I think it was more in their Concertgebouw's repertoire to have like maybe an orchestra night in blue, or they would do a film screening and the orchestra would play, and they would have like live video puppets. I saw a really cool, I think, Cinderella when I was there. But they were activating lights or using color in a way that I think is not necessarily traditional.
To set the mood, to change, you walk into the room and the lighting just immediately gives you information about what to expect. And I think we are very accustomed to the standard of having this warm white light, fully lit, and so we can see the musicians very, very clearly. And I think that's still very important. However, I think something new and different enters in if you do a blue wash or a yellow wash, or there's warm colors or cool colors can really influence just the general mood and sensation.
Yeah, corresponding to the piece, the composer maybe. I was thinking, how do you talk about the limits? How do you determine what's too much, if at all? Do you talk about that? Or you kind of go all the way and see what's the maximum? I noticed that the whole started flickering more towards the very, very end of the show. When we did the run-throughs, I was waiting, what's going to happen with the statues? What's going to happen with the ceiling? That was only until the very end. And that was obviously intentional. Could we talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it just depends on what the minimum and maximum is in the room itself, and where the limits are. And so part of the limits are budget, load-in times and strike times, and the schedule of the hall. So how much equipment can you load in, when does it need to be struck, how many outside shows are happening where they would need to do like a big turnover. But then I think also, we struggled both to some extent in Concertgebouw and at Boston, just because of the brightness of the stand lights, where we don't have a lot of control over that element. I think having more subtle stand lights, or having iPads would really be the solution to that problem. But it is what it is, and the musicians are more visible because of the standlights to the audience, and that is part of the show now. That's not necessarily a drawback. There's a little less color, but there's more visibility on the performers themselves.
I would say I almost never worry about going too far because it's such a rare occurrence where you're like, oh, and you know when you've gone too far and you're like, oh, we gotta back that up. Like when we caught in the concert about the first time we did it, we caught the stand lights in the final because they were on dimmers and connected to the lighting board, so they were part of that final flickering effect.
Yeah, it was
an accident.
It was an undulating cue, and so the stand lights were doing this dramatic rise and drop side to side. It looked very organic because it was timed.
It was all
to
timed to the same thing. It was very cool, but without being told by them, we knew that was too much, and then they told us it was too much as well.
And
definitely agreed. But so I think it's part of just trying to push as far as you can go with what you have and learning what the tricks of the room are going to be, and then knowing that as you start to build, you can't always give everything in every moment, or you're not going to have something at the, something for the moment you really need it. Like that's the reason we only see the normal white light that they use for the orchestra is only in the final cue. The house lights are only in the final cue, because we knew cueing through it that if we had started to put that stuff in earlier, we just wouldn't have somewhere to go at the end. Knowing that it's going to be really unexpected to see the house lights start to flicker in the same way that the stage lights are as like a final cataclysmic event.
When I was working with Justin for the Cape Cod Symphony Orchestra, there was a moment, and I think it was towards the end, where there were spots moving very rapidly. There were very large movements in very large spots and coming from behind. And for some reason, that was the first time that I ever felt kind of a motion sickness or a vertigo or something in the piece. And we did get a note from management saying, you have to slow this down. The audience members are going to be sick. And we did a little bit of that, but Justin was really pushing back on that because the piece is not supposed to be comfortable. It's not supposed to be something that is just it's not supposed to be pleasant necessarily. And so I think there is a version of the piece that we could do that could be very disturbing, like actually make people feel almost unwell by the end. I want people to feel like they enjoyed it and they weren't made sick by it. But I think that there is a version of this piece that could exist that would be in that realm. And maybe it could be marketed to a different clientele.
And the one thing I will say is that in terms of limiting ourselves, I guess I never thought about this as putting a hard limit on it, because it's just a thing that I'm so used to. But the par lights that we have above the Luce are rarely used above like 10% max intensity, because I know that is something that's going to affect the audience in a way, and if we just keep flashing them, it's going to be annoying and too much. So we really reserve any intensity in those to really punctuate moments we needed.
Mostly for the end.
And again, to save something for the end, but also to not annoy the audience.
So the ending is just majestic. That's all you need to have there.
And when I was doing a different show, Carmina Burana, which was it's a longer piece for in the first place, and it involved projections instead of lights, so there's already more to look at. We did build in moments of visual silence so the audience could take a break. So it would just be like a feature on a soloist, for example, or we would have the melody begin in darkness, and then the projection would come on as soon as the accompaniment would start or something. So we kind of look at focusing on different parts of the musical texture to highlight the varied ways that the piece was written, but then also kind of give the audience a little bit of a break so that they could be wowed by the by the big moments instead of just kind of exhausted by them. So I think there's a balance that can be struck, especially with very visually demanding shows, that you can give the audience a little bit of that relief to kind of prepare them, refresh them, to then be just really kind of taken away by the next big moment that happens.
Any special moments? Anything? Any specific associations, memories, maybe from previous productions? Something that really goes deep inside for a long time, and also did the perception of this music, and maybe including Carmina Burana also, and other interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary shows, did the perception of the music change for you, or both, each of you, after you have created these productions with light?
I'm curious to have you answer this question first.
So as far as special moments, it's a really interesting thing to build something that someone plays that is responsive as a musical instrument, because that's really not I work with interactivity a lot, and there are various degrees of what level a performer has control over whatever we built for that show. But there isn't really anything quite like building, and Anna and I were talking about this, is often it's giving parameters of control to a performer, like intensity or an effect, or like they have a small control over a thing that is pre-built. Whereas the Luce is a little different because the colors are preset to Scriabin in a way that the scale is set. But really a lot of it is being played by somebody. Intensity is something that can be added to it. Different effects, the way the effects stack. At one point we were playing with effect rates being controlled. And those possibilities, and learning about how somebody uses something as an instrument versus somebody modifies something that you've already built, is a really exciting way to work. It was amazing to be in that weird garage in Amsterdam with Daniel and Mike, and just starting to figure out what it means to actually be played by. And also me playing in a basement is obviously different than, orchestra, synth/organ player getting his hands on it.
So I think the evolution of the Luce is a fascinating topic, going back to what is the user interface. So the very first Luce, designed by Alexander Moser, has a row of 12 buttons. So that's the interface. When Prometheus premiered in New York City in 1915, they got the Edison testing laboratories to design that Luce, and it did have a keyboard that was about the range of a tenth, and then it had foot pedals connected to a rheostat that could do some fluctuations in dynamics, and I think that maybe, I can't remember what else the performer could control. I know that the lights were on a moving belt, but I don't know the extent to which that was something that was just like set into motion, or the performer had control over that. But then for our first Luce, it was, trying to even remember, the notation was completely different. It was, so I know we had individual pitches. We couldn't layer. We could do the whole wheel. We couldn't do individual pitches. I'm sorry, I'm remembering now. We could do the whole wheel and effects, but I'm trying to, the dynamics only with a slider. That's what
the way it was explained to me is that you had a MIDI keyboard that could trigger essentially 10-second video samples that needed to be re-triggered. And then there was a light board connected to that could adjust dynamics, but there was no touch sensitivity.
Yeah, no touch sensitivity. Yeah. But there was a slider, because I do remember that there was some dynamic change through the slider. But then when Matt came on board for Concertgebouw, he completely designed a new instrument, so new video assets, touch sensitive keyboard.
And one of the things that I was most excited by is a lot of it is generated from basic assets. So the choice to rearticulate versus the choice to let something run, like the lightning effect, are two different ways to use the lightning effect, based on what the performer wants to do.
Yeah. And then I think the upgrade that this performance has is just the addition of the volume pedal. And that, I think, has just so much more potential than what we were even able to do for this piece. And I think that if we had maybe a day or two more, we would see the evolution of the Luce and the Luce performance go even beyond what we're going to see now. And maybe by Saturday, yes,
exactly.
There might be even more. Yeah. And I think it also, there are some performers who, the first Luce player was Andre Redwood, who's a pianist and a percussion player. And he was just game for anything. So I would do all these revisions to the arrangement and give it to him right before the performance, and he would just play and then give me feedback that I would incorporate in. And he could also do improvisation with some of the effects, because he spent more time with the instrument rehearsing than I did. So he learned how to use the slider and do this, cross hand stuff. And then Dan too had this very open mentality, and so they were able to set the Luce up in this warehouse in Amsterdam, and so we did our coaching because the hall was not available. We did our coaching in this warehouse so that the Luce is just hanging.
The star was just
hanging,
okay.
And he was incredibly excited, and we had to run the whole piece because I can't anticipate. I'm making this arrangement with no visual feedback. I'm not making it on the instrument. So I had to have him play through it and take notes and make adjustments to the part. And then his feedback got folded into that. And so it really does take like this multi-stage collaboration between, we have the original part that the composer wrote, then we have my arrangement, then we have Matt's instrument that he built, then we have my arrangement and then we have the performer who's layering on all these additional choices and nuance and finding things that neither of us necessarily anticipate. And I really love that openness that the Luce offers to have all of these different collaborations where none of us really own the full part of the Luce. It's something that we're each contributing to.
It's so great to watch this development of the instrument that was envisioned more than 100 years ago, and finally now it's growing into this very beautiful, very real instrument. And let's see what happens next, because I have a feeling this is not the end.
Yeah, I hope not. It seems like it was the end in 2020, but I'm glad it isn't.
So Scriabin incorporated certain messages and moods into each of the colors and tonal centers and keys. But did you adapt this yourself, or you have another vision and you agree with Scriabin obviously because you're doing this, or there is another intake? Did it take time to kind of grow into this? How are you now communicating to Scriabin's system? Has it become part of each of you, or it's just a language that he has created?
Well, so part of my original interest in this piece was the metaphysics of it, the philosophy behind it, the idea that a work of art could change reality. That's a very interesting concept to me. And then the means through which this takes place is the combination of the sound and the light that is really supposed to do something to us that an ordinary symphony could not do, or an ordinary theatrical performance could not do. So I had this real strong sense going into my collaboration with Justin, the first realization that I did, that this light show was absolutely unique. Like no one had no one else was thinking this way at that time. And I feel a lot of sympathy towards Scriabin. I think he's been very misunderstood. Certainly this piece has been very misunderstood. And I think part of my motivation is to say, well, most people haven't actually seen a light show that is an interpretation of the composer's notation. I am interpreting the composer's notation just like the musicians are interpreting the composer's notation, but most shows don't even try to interpret the notation. So what if I took this seriously? What would happen to the lights if I took these notations seriously and was very careful about maintaining contact with the score and adapting it to the hall with the designer? And our collaborations look very, very different than a lot of other realizations that you might see on YouTube today that are working with the same technology and sometimes even in the same halls, because of that closeness that we maintain with the original script. I think my conception of the piece has changed over time, because again, it is just so rare to see this piece performed live. I don't know if there's another person who has done it 5 times with lights. I think it's rare for designers to do it multiple times in a row. So you are at an advantage having worked on it twice, to do it in 2 different halls, and Justin as well. And so I really think that, in the concert repertoire, every single other piece has the benefit of multiple orchestras putting on multiple performances that are interpretations of the script, of the score. And you get to know how these pieces go. They sound, we know how Beethoven's Fifth Symphony sounds. We know how Tristan and Isolde sounds. We have a certain set of expectations. There are no expectations for this piece because it's performed so rarely. And most of the time, it is not an interpretation of the composer's original notes. But I think, I wish it was performed more. I think it could be performed more, maybe at smaller scale, because there are so many halls that have in-house lighting systems now. But I think the piece that is very difficult to pull off is the artistic interpretation, because it requires a design team that cares about what a dead composer wrote, right? That is, aiming to be true to that. And then it also takes collaboration with a musician who understands how to read the notation and understands kind of the limits of interpretation when interpreting a musical work. So every single pitch has color and duration encoded in it. And that is absolutely accurate, just as it would be for a musician. If Scriabin writes a crescendo, we make the lights get brighter because we know that what that means, but we have a lot of room in interpreting, well, how bright do the lights go? Is it very gentle? Is it very dramatic lift? Just like a musician interpreting a crescendo might have, a range of options, but, they are making decisions about how far to push some of these articulation and dynamic markings. So I think it's very analogous. Great. I want to hear what you have to say.
There's a few things, because weird that I told Anna this, but the first thing when I first met Justin, the first show I talked about him kind of out of his career was the Scriabin piece, because I was interested in it. And what was interesting to me about it is that when I think there's something really great about getting to realize somebody's work that was never achieved in their life, but something that, like, we work in that world now. It's not something that, we know we have the ability to do it, so why not give it a try? But what I like about that piece in particular is it isn't us putting lights on a show. The lights are scored to a show. There are notes from the composer, and we are doing the same thing as we would do if we played an instrument. And I like that organic way of working. It's not often we are adding lights to a script or a score or music, but there's something really beautiful about it being written and working under the same constraints as another member of the orchestra would work. And I also really like that it is bringing something to an audience who isn't as well acquainted with that technology or that style of art making and design. And again, it's under the lens of honoring a piece and doing it the way as best we can, what the composer wanted.
Yeah. And
I think that's a really exciting place to be, where this will probably be the first time some people have seen shows like this, lighting wise. And I think it's always great when you get to do something like that.
And I think that what I said to the orchestra is something that I still believe very strongly. The notations in the score invite us to do a light show that's more choreographic. So there are much more cues. The cues are much shorter. There are events that happen on the beat, with the beat, either even eighth notes that are written into the score. And in a regular theatrical design, that is not the case. The cues are typically much longer. Realism is very much longer, and then possibly some experimental would speed that up quite a bit. It is actually more analogous to what happens in analytical light shows with rock concerts, because you'll have some strobe flashing maybe with the bass, and then there'll be these different layers of lighting events that kind of mimic the layer of the texture. And I find it very interesting that we have these incredibly rich musical lighting designs in the popular concert sphere, where potentially they are, how to best say this, they are either meeting or exceeding the textural density of the music itself. And in a piece like this, the textural density is incredibly dense score. So many timbres and so many counter melodies and just textures. And the default option for this piece is to make a much more gentle show, to make much longer cues, to make it more atmospheric, more cinematic, make it very gentle, make it very safe, have very small, focused lighting events. And that's not Scriabin at all. So I would love to do this piece in a stadium one day. I would love to do it with pyrotechnics. I would love to do it with lasers. I would love to do it with holograms. I mean, I think the sky is the limit. Yeah. Well, and the budget, is the limit. But I think this piece could take a treatment where we were in a hall that was just more amenable to that level of design and
yeah. Because for me, it is rare to work like this, where we walk in and the lighting is set. Often for my shows, we would either rent or pull from an inventory, but we would really customize the lighting to what we need. We put the lights in all the places we want. We make sure we have the right lights, and we would really curate the system to the piece in a way that there's something really nice about getting to honor what these halls have to offer and what they live with every day, and really getting to explore in ways that the staff aren't used to seeing, which is always really exciting. But there is a world where it would be great to see this piece where we got to build it from the ground up and see how big we could get.
Yeah. Pulling the thread, you mentioned all these things you would love to do. If we don't think about the budget, hypothetically, other art genres, other artistic media, dance,
like dance
and installations.
Yeah. Oh yes. Well, I feel like this piece is calling for projections, and I think it is calling for pyrotechnics in a very real way. And I think that there's this ritual element, Prometheus, Prometheus being kind of grounded in this Greek ritual theater tradition. I think that there may be a version of this that is almost semi-staged with the chorus, where there's a dramatic role for the chorus instead of just sitting behind and singing. I think, possibly Bacchic dancers, right? You could imagine
building a temple.
Yeah. Build a temple that then crashes to the ground. Exactly.
Wonderful. I love these plans. On this note, let's go to the first shot.
Okay.
Thank you so much.